So we know now that the very first thing that we need to do in order to use a web service is to get the WSDL file for the web service. Now I want to put together an application that allows me to get weather information based on the zip code, and looking for a WSDL for that, I've come across one that looks like it's pretty straightforward to use, and this is the file or the URL that I need for Genero to extract from this information exactly the information needed to use these functions, such as getting the weather by zip code, by name, and the type of weather data that is received. Now again, when working with web services, you want to work with a trusted source. Now I don't know much about this webservicex.net organization, but for purposes of demonstration, this is a very simple way to show you how web service would work. But again, you'd want to be getting a WSDL file from a trusted source so that you know that your service is always going to be up and running when your application goes to request information from it. So once I have this information, then I can begin working on the web service itself. So now that I have the WSDL information, what I'm going to do is copy that file into my current directory that I'm going to work from. Now you don't have to copy the WSDL file. You can use the URL to that file as part of its usage for building the client that's using those services. But for this example, I've copied it into the directory. So the next thing I'll want to do is use the FGL WSDL tool to extract from this WSDL file the function information that's going to be used so that I can work with this service. So here I'm going to go ahead and type FGL WSDL -lowercase o. Now I need to provide a name for the 4GL and the include globals file that are going to be created, and I'll call those weather client. And then I'm going to name my WSDL file that I want to use here. Now again, this is where you could be identifying the URL to that WSDL file. So when I hit return, and now if I look in the directory, I can see that it has created for me a 4GL file and an include file. At this point, let's switch over to Genero Studio so that we can look at these files a bit more visually. The WSDL can also be accessed and used through Genero Studio. Once you have an application node, you can right-click on the node and choose Add Web Services. The Web Services wizard will allow you to identify where the description file is, the WSDL file is located, and you can supply a URL, or you can supply the file, and ours was Weather Forecast WSDL. You can look at that file. Then on the next dialog of the wizard, I can choose whether to add the web services to the project. If I utilize this option, the WSDL file or copy of it will be added to the project, and when the project is built or rebuilt, the generated 4GL and include file will be created and placed in the output directory. If you choose advanced, the generated files will actually be a part of the project. So it's very much like going ahead and running the FGL WSDL tool from the command line as we did before. So if I choose this option and choose Finish, you'll see that I have the WSDL file, an untitled 4GL, and an untitled to include file, and those are generated as part of the project. So your options are to either use the FGL WSDL tool at the command line, or you can use the Web Services wizard by right-clicking on your application node and choosing Add Web Services. All right, so here I am in Studio. What I want to do is create a new project, and I'll call this project my weather project. And I'll add a new application. and I can call this application my weather application. Now I want to add files that already exist, those files that I generated with the FGL WSDL tool. So I'll go ahead and choose those and go into my directory where I was working and select the files that I want to include. Now if I hadn't generated those files, I certainly could at this point use the Web Services wizard to generate those. If we open these files, we'll see that they do have a header telling you that they are generated and not to modify these files. You'll also notice that the include file has the globals information, and the 4GL file has the user functions, the functions that we're going to use in order to get information. But notice here, if we look at some of the code, there are some calls to start the envelope for the SOAP request, etc. So all of those pieces that package up the request and allow us to unpack the response are all handled for you simply by using that tool on a WSDL file to extract the right information. So again, so far I have not written any 4GL code, but I'm going to do that now, and what I want to create is a Genero application that I can use with these functions to go and get that weather information. So let's go ahead and create a new file, and I'm just going to call this weather main. And of course in this file I'm going to need a main and an end main. And that's where I'm going to put my logic. But I'm also going to need to import the library com, which includes the web services methods that we will use to request and get the information. So I'm going to import com there so I can use those methods. And I'm also going to make a reference to the globals file. And we called that weatherclient.inc. Now in my main, what I'm going to do is use the WS status variable to determine if our web service has been successful, and if it has, we'll go ahead and display some information that the web service allows us to extract. So let's first just define a variable WS status. The next thing we're going to do is set the zip code variable equal to the zip code that we want to request information from. So generally what we want to do in this little application is provide the zip code to the web service and have it return some weather related information based on that zip code. Now if I go over to my globals, I can see that there is get weather by place, there's information, there's also get weather by zip code. Let's see if we can expand this a little bit. And here's what I'm looking for here, get weather by zip code. And there's a zip code variable defined in that record that I'm going to use to provide some information. So let's go back to our main, and we're going to just set that get weather by zip code, and there it comes up, it's a record that's available, equal to, and we'll just do Bellevue, Washington, which is 98004. So again, that's a string. We saw in our globals definition that that was a string variable. And let's by zip code, there it is. And we're providing the string of 98004. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is get information based on that zip code that we're providing. So what we want to do is display the get weather by zip code response. So again, we're looking for a record that we can use to get information based on what's called. Get the results. Now we're going to go into this record, get the details, and see if there's something there that we can use. There's the weather data. Let's go ahead and just get we're only using one element in the array there, and we can pick, let's just get the max temperature Fahrenheit. So from this, based on this zip code that we are using, this is what we want to get back. So the call that we're going to make to the service is set up as a global function in our weather client 4GL file, the one that was generated. So if we just open that, we can see over here that we have a get weather by zip code, and one of those, the WS status, comes back as a part of that. So what we're going to do is go ahead and call that and display the information that's returned. So let's let WS status equal a call to the get weather by zip code global function. So again, what this is saying is we want to call this function. This function is in our weather client 4GL file that was generated from the WSDL file. But part of that function that was built is to make that connection to the service and provide the information that we are supplying. So here we're going to supply 98004 for the zip code, which is a variable recognized in this function. The status, if it comes back correctly, and we could add some error checking around this status here. Once we get information back from this variable or from this function, we're going to display the max temperature. So let's just go ahead and compile this. And one thing we're going to note is as we compile this that we're going to need to add the helper module because many of these functions are not recognized. So to do that, we're simply going to pull up the properties, and we're going to add as an external dependency a module called wshelper.42m, capital wshelper.42m. All right, then we should be able to compile that. Now that the program compiles, now when we run the program, we should see the display there on the output. And sure enough, we get 50, which is the max temperature for Bellevue for today. So certainly we could add on to this and add some additional code that helped to clarify what the request was and for what zip code the request was for, and add some other data along with the max temperature. For example, the minimum temperature or weather image was another piece of information that was available, and use that in an application. Here simply we're just displaying it to the output. So now I've added some additional code. I've added an if statement to check the WS status variable, And if we get an error, we're going to display WS error description, which is a record variable available to us to use for any error. And then we're going to display the weather for the zip code that we passed in, and then the information. So let's go ahead and compile this again and run it. And now we can see weather for 98004 on Monday, November 30th, 2009 is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now let's go ahead and change this to a zip code that's not recognized by the service. You can see that we get our display information, weather for, but we don't get anything else. So it's not actually an error. There just was no information in the values that were passed back. If we do a comment this out. If we make no request at all, so I commented out our request based on the zip code information, we didn't pass any information at all, you can see the big long error description that we get. So let's solve that, and let's see sunny California. We'll see what the weather is there. And sunny California Southern California has a temperature today of a high of 73 degrees. So again, the purpose of this is to show you how you would walk through using information from a WSDL file that you've received from a partner vendor, somebody that you're going to be exchanging data with. And in this example, you are consuming a web service. So again, the steps were simply to use the tool to extract the information from the WSDL file, and then to use that information, those records and functions, use those in your own code to call and display or utilize whatever information is passed from that service.